Mostafa needs no introduction. Many of you know him already. He has been with us since August as the Dean's Distinguished Visiting Professor and will be with us until December. Mostafa has been teaching a graduate course. Some of you are attending. So Mostafa actually is a PhD from University of Waterloo. After a bachelor at MIT, he came here for PhD, and then went to become a professor at Georgia Tech. Where he is right now, the Regents Professor of Computer Science. So Mostafa has been working in networking for many years. And actually will take us on a ride. Share with us is the story of networking, at least from his perspective. Mostafa is a fellow of the IEEE, is a fellow of the ACM. Last time he visited us before this visit was to receive actually the Alumni Achievement Award from the University of Waterloo. Without further ado, Mostafa, welcome, and please.
Thank you. Thank you, Raouf. So I want to, first of all, thank the College of Math, the Faculty of Math, and the School of Computer Science for inviting me to visit and hosting my visit. Everyone has been so kind. As you know, I kind of learned my way through how to run the class and how to teach and finding an office and all this stuff. So I really appreciate it. It's a homecoming for me. I finished here in '85, so it's a long time ago, and things have changed quite a bit. Of course, always to the better. So I'm really proud to call myself a Waterloo alum, and you know, it's a homecoming of sorts. So I definitely encourage you as you get older to go back to where you went to school, because you will feel much younger. So all I have to do is walk the streets here and I remember things, you know, when I was in my 20s. So it's great to be back and great to give this talk. I also want to acknowledge, I left this up, I'll take it down, but Johnny Wong is my advisor from my PhD, and I really just want to acknowledge his mentorship and the training I got from him lives with me to this day. So, okay, so what I want to talk to you today, I hopefully have a chance to look at this poem. It's actually a longer poem, it's called Mutation, it's actually quite interesting. But it basically says you should not be unhappy that things are changing, because if things were not to change, this would be the reason to weep and be unhappy. So this whole thing is really about change. Okay. So this is about change, and what we're going to do is first of all get on. Someone asked me earlier, what is it, the vehicle that you're going to use for time travel? And I'm going to choose a DeLorean. If you've seen this movie, Back to the Future. Actually, I can do this if you want to know how to do it, let me know. But basically, we leave in '85 and we just land back here today. So we jump over all this entire, essentially 37-year period of time. And I think this kind of thought experiment is very useful to appreciate how things change drastically and also in a lot of unexpected ways. And it's one way to think about, you know, how relevant what we are thinking of today. So I mean, think of the difference between today and 30 years from now, and the only way really to appreciate that is to do it backwards, because we don't know exactly what's going to happen 30 years from now. You know, again, to appreciate it, this is my memories when I was a student of the state-of-the-art kind of computing that we had. And Waterloo has always been kind of the forefront of state-of-the-art computing. And of course now it's like unrecognizable. This is still actually looks to me like from the future with the train and the futuristic looking building. Okay, so the first question I want to ask, what is hidden up there says then and now. But the question is how many networks? And I'm going to start with this question because this is central to my discussion later on. So in 1985, we were learning from books like this. This is one of the famous textbooks of the time of networking by Misha Schwartz from Columbia. And if you go to the book, and I will actually have occasion to quote something from the book later on, but if you go to the book, And it was really very difficult to learn about network because there was no one thing. So in fact, this book actually describes this long list of networks, and for each of them, it describes how each of them works. And you know, to pass your test, you have to remember how everyone works. Buried in the middle of this is this ARPANET, right, which is really the precursor of the internet today, but we didn't know it. In '85, these are all looked legitimate. In fact, some of them looked even more powerful. The IBM, product, SNA, and the other thing is a lot of them have very cool ideas about networks, about how we should structure them. Today, of course, we really think, and when you teach a class, you teach the internet, you teach TCP/IP, there's one thing, and it's in some sense easier to kind of focus on one set of technology. The question actually that I will ask for later is it really one network today? And we'll talk about that later. But at least, we have this abstraction that we are really working in one network and everything is connected. So what does the network look like? And 85, again, there were many networks, but let's look at ARPANET. And ARPANET, this is what it looked like in the US. Just a few nodes, entirely within the US. I dug up this is actually from 1970s, but this is the equivalent of ARPANET in Canada. This was called DataPack. And it had switches, in Northern Telecom switches in various cities. This is an older version. I think eventually it had more switches and almost the size of ARPANET at the time. Of course, today, all of these networks kind of melted together, and it's very hard, in fact, to visualize because it's a global network. This is probably the best visualization I know of. This is an older picture because as things got even more crowded, you don't actually see very much in this picture anymore. But it's a picture of what the internet looks like. There are approximately 70,000 dots in this picture, nodes, if you will. Each node, in fact, is a network. It's not a router anymore. Whereas here, each node is a router. And so the scale of what we're dealing with today is completely incredible and certainly not something you could have imagined, working in the 80s. Okay, internet architecture, and I'll have more to say about this. This is the book, again, another book that everyone learned from by Tenenbaum, Computer Networks, and in the first few editions, he had this picture of the OSI 7 layers. OSI stands for Open System Interconnect, and it was supposed to be an international standard for data networks. Okay. That has basically gone away in terms of what networks look like, and this is more kind of the modern way of looking at networks. Turns out this is the ARPANET model, which is supposed to be 4 layers: application, transport, network layer, and link layer, and this adds a physical layer. So it's a 5 layer.
But it's still 7 layers.
I think this is just 1 layer. The application.
I see 7.
There's no room to put actually all of this is application. DHCP, HTTP, all of this is application. Okay, so content distribution, this actually I think is interesting. And one point I want to make is that networks are to deliver services. And a lot of times in networking, we think of networking for its own sake, as opposed to thinking that it's just a vehicle to deliver something for us, for humanity, for society, for enterprise, for profit, whatever you think about it, but it's delivering something. The idea that it's there to do something is very important. And it turns out that that something is really much more important than the technology. And I think this is something that will drive the future, is that and so in 1985, we actually had content distribution. So, we all think that all the things that we can do today is because of the internet. We never even could conceive of them before the internet. This is pre-internet. There is no internet here. This was actually systems, John is listening, will remember the teletext and videotext systems that were run on cable networks, had no TCP/IP inside, no internet inside. The displays of television, old television, screens and so on, so the display technology. It had everything you think of. In fact, there's something, if you can read this, says telesoftware. You could download software into your cable box, essentially. using, and of course, he had all the other things about travel and weather and so on and so forth. So of course today, content distribution, we think of it is really the driving force behind the internet, and we do a lot with content. But the point I want to make here is that the desire to distribute content predates the internet and is much more important in some sense than the technology that we used to do. Okay, this is a little bit interesting. I think people that have done research will realize that if you trained in 85 and you wake up in 2022, it doesn't matter how successful you were in 85, there's absolutely no way you can succeed in 2022. So the first thing that we learned in 85 was networks were going to be like everything else. You design them, you build them, and you sit back and enjoy them. That was the idea, that once you have figured out how to build them and all that, you're going to sit back and enjoy them. And in fact, this is an old paper by the pioneers of information theory and did networking work a little bit later in his career. But basically, this is a paper with one of his students called Stami that and basically and again, you can treat the title of the flow control and routing algorithms for data networks. So I think today, in a class, you would give probably 2 weeks worth of lectures, maybe 5 weeks worth of lectures on flow control and routing, right? I mean, they were writing all the algorithms. They thought they were going to model them and analyze them. So, but it turned out that it's kind of a nightmare because there is no end to this, right? I mean, I think if you're a researcher and you're looking for an end game in networking research, it doesn't exist today, because basically what we do is we build these monsters. You saw the 70,000 network, right? That we totally don't understand. It doesn't matter how well you designed it and all that. We just don't understand what it does. So in order to figure it out, it now becomes like, you look at the human body and you need to figure out what it does. So you probe it and put electricity here, and you scan things here and there and try to guess. You measure, and then you decide, well, the difference is, of course, you can change things a little bit, you tweak it a little bit, but this goes on and on and on and on, and it's kind of a, so if you train with this mindset that there's going to be an end, you're going to solve the problem and you'll be done. It doesn't work this way. And today the training, we all train our students this way, that basically this is a big thing that, we just keep working on it and iterate on the design and understand. I just picked some things here from on data center networks, which is yet another technology that's kind of tricky. Okay, so this is another one that I think is interesting as well. In 1985, so if you take so ACM SIGCOMM conference is today the most prestigious kind of one of the most prestigious networking conferences. Very hard to get in, several rounds of reviews and so on. In 85, actually, the concept of a prestigious conference did not exist. Right? So the idea, the conference existed, but no one talked about, oh, this is a prestigious conference, this is not a conference. Everyone went to the conference just to meet everyone else, right? The idea that, and published, in journals for like that. But if you look up the ACM SIGCOMM 85, you find that it had 22 papers. Most important thing is the average authors per paper is 1.9, around 2. The maximum authors per paper is 3. There's no more than 3 authors for any of the papers. Okay, and again, flow control here was all consuming. But the titles were very explicit, and we were doing small things. What should the window size be for flow control? Today, this is what it looks like. So I actually updated this talk. I did this recently, ACM SIGCOMM 22. Has a lot of papers, so the numbers have gone up actually quite a bit in recent years. The average of authors per paper is 6.8. Turns out there are, normally, if you go back, you don't find single author papers. This year, there's one person has 2 papers by himself at SIGCOMM. Hire this guy, Anyway, but otherwise, there are no single author papers. There were actually several single author papers here by different people. But the maximum is 23. So there are papers with 23 authors. So personally, I don't know what that means, but and this is good stuff and good writing. But anyway, these are the titles now, you know. Software-defined network assimilation, bridging the last mile towards centralized network configuration management with NAS. I have no idea what they're talking about. Actually, it's a very good paper, I should say. I read the abstract and dug a little deeper into the paper, so it's actually quite interesting. But you know, if you look at this is where we are, right? Things are just extremely complex. A single person sitting in an office can't do, although there is a proof to the contrary here, but a single author sitting in the room can't do work, you know, quality work anymore. There's a lot more I can say, but let me move on. So, you know, my research kind of tracked this. This is what I looked like in '85. And I dug up this paper, one of my first journal papers with Johnny. I remember that work very fondly. But actually, I was doing single author papers after I graduated. So this is my first paper from my work at Georgia Tech. But again, you know, I was in this mindset that we were gonna, you know, model and write equations and solve things that way. Today, I haven't hit the 23, but I've hit 6 or 7. So I do work in larger groups and on much more complicated stuff. Right? So this is the.
Yeah, also, the old paper is scanned in. This is the PDF.
This is, right, this is a PDF. Well, both of these I do like a screen grab, right? So this is cut off here. But anyway, yeah, but you're right. I mean, the way we preserve documents is quite different. Okay, so I can keep going, but let's kind of get off the DeLorean and stop going back and forth. And what I want to do is actually try to understand what the journey looks like, right? And try to see if there are patterns that we can discern and really learn about in the future. Okay, so there are a few caveats. I'm going to talk a little bit about history and progression of things. I'm not rewriting history. I'm trying to put structure on it. The other thing is, I don't really mean to ever be critical because I'm just as guilty as everyone. So if I say something that sounds like criticizing how people did this, it's really not my intention. But also, any prediction I make, you know, just realize it's very difficult to make predictions. And so who knows? Okay, so I'm going to give you 3 things, right? First of all, I'm going to try to talk about what's the evolutionary pattern that kind of drives networks. And from that, we're going to see that something is happening to this pattern if you believe that this pattern is accurate. In fact, there's nothing revolutionary about it. But something is happening to it. First of all, it led us to this notion of a single network, right? And I will argue with you that as we go forward, we're not going to have the single network anymore. At least, you know, it may be good as an abstraction to think of it as a single network, but actually we really need to start thinking about the world of many networks. Okay, so there are a few takeaways. First of all, so this is a time when you can wake up and then you can sleep and wake up at the end. But I'm going to show you that there's an iterative process, which shouldn't be surprising in how networks developed. The next thing is that there's nothing fundamental. I think we all grew up learning that the internet's such a great thing, and all, you know, it's ubiquitous and connects everyone to everyone. But I want to kind of try to convince you that there's nothing fundamental about this. It could have gone in a lot of different directions. And in fact, ultimately now it's going in a different direction, that we have these many networks. Okay. I have some more formal kind of thing with citations about these arguments in a communication, CCR, Computer Communications Review. Okay, so the first thing I want to say is that networks really develop according to this saying, necessity is the mother of invention. I think to think of it otherwise is different, is wrong, in fact, to think about networks just coming out of nowhere. Basically, we have a need, and the need is to support services, and this is the point I was making, that these services come first, right? The fact that we want to do content distribution, we want to social networks, whatever it is we want to do, stream video and so on. And then the networks come later, and so we start with that, and that's the necessity. And then we deploy infrastructure and networks to do it. Okay? And I'm not talking about experimental stuff. I'm talking about now real networks, because you need to have some need for them to deploy. And so if you want to say necessity is another invention in kind of network language, you say service or scale support motivates infrastructure deployment, right? I mean, again, nothing revolutionary about this observation. So, but here's a kind of a picture of how this might look like. We have a network service. Sometimes actually the motivation, the necessity is increased scale. We just have the same service with more people accessing. And then we build the infrastructure, and then we realize slowly that we maybe can do something a little bit different, and that takes us back to something, another kind of need that then requires us to update the infrastructure. Okay. So this has kind of been going on for a while. Okay. Around 2005, people started saying things like this: the inability of the internet architecture to adapt to new pressures and requirements. So that became known as network ossification. Basically, it's like, the internet is old, and you can't teach an old dog new tricks, although I don't believe that. But that's kind of the same. And there's the word ossification kind of started showing up in papers, and you can see here that led to its growing ossification. Alterations in internet architecture that address its fundamental deficiencies or enable new services have been restricted to incremental changes. So at this point, we stopped being able to respond to new requirements. So a way to model this here is very simple, basically saying that this is broken. That although we can continue to think of new things to do, the network itself, as we try to upgrade it, is unable to. There is more to this. And so let me show you kind of an example here of what it looked like. So if you look at routing, which is a very fundamental function of networks, which is how to take data from one point to another in the network. And as the network grew, the scale becomes much more complicated, and the routing becomes much more difficult and needed new things. So if you track what happened over time, you get this. So this graph shows you over time here. It stops at 215, but it doesn't matter really because ossification will kick in before then. And this is the number of connected hosts. These are not meaningful anymore, but it's one way to, this is in log scale, of course, on the y-axis, but you can see the significant growth of the network over time. And if you track routing developments, you'll see this. In around 1968, 69, there was this paper by Prosser that talked about routing. And in fact, if you read this paper, it had two parts. Pretty much everything we do in routing is there. The ideas are there, but they didn't have the network, didn't have the capacity, it was all on paper. Then when the internet started taking shape, people developed something called distance vector routing. The details are not important, but distance vector routing doesn't scale. It doesn't grow beyond the small network. So as the networks grew, they developed another scheme called link state routing, which scales a little bit better. Still, it can work only in a certain scope of network, and as the network grew larger, we started getting hierarchical routing. Exterior gateway protocol allowed the network to grow. But as the network grew even bigger, we needed something different, which is border gateway protocol. And there were several versions of this. Ultimately, around 2005 or so, there was this BGP version 4. But look at all this activity, right, over the years, as the scale grows. And the scale kept growing, but we got stuck. So in fact, today, we're still using BGP. Despite a lot of attempts to clean it, there are security issues with BGP and so on, but there hasn't really been a whole lot happening since this last BGP version for lots of reasons. But that's what ossification looks like, is that there is always need for new things, but we're just not able to do it at this point. Okay. And if you read the BGP documents, you'll see things that show you the cycle. that show you how they learn from one iteration to the next. So the BGP RFC will say, RFC course is the Internet Standardization Documents. It will say something that BGP was built on experience or with EGP, right? And experience as it was deployed, used it, right? So this cycle really was very nice. And the moment we stopped being able to iterate over it is when we got into trouble. Okay. So now I want to kind of take you through this concept of a single network. So this cycle took us to this place of a single network. And my favorite analogy is a single network is like the Swiss Army knife, right? Has a lot of tools that it's nice to have because you can put it in your pocket and all that. Okay? The point I'll make, and I'll make it now, is that if I call someone to do some renovations in my house, and he comes in and opens up and gets a Swiss Army knife, okay, see you later, I'm going to call someone else. So the point is, the Swiss Army knife is great. This one tool that does a lot of things is great, but up to a point. Okay, so here's where we are. I showed you all the networks that we were talking about. And the idea was we had actually networks for different things. Some of these networks were enterprise networks. There was an experimental network. I think ARPANET and DataPack were mostly experimental at the time. We had time-sharing network and so on. However, we have now one network, and I don't think we appreciate the fact that this happened, because I think it could have gone, like I said, in lots of different ways. There were really three main driving factors. One of them is connectivity was the main goal. We really didn't think about what we are going to do with it. We just said if we can get bit pipes to everyone, then we can figure it out. And the way to do it is just have one network that gets bit pipes from everywhere to everywhere. The other thing that we needed was basically scalability and scalability at a good cost. So we needed to cover a lot of people. So in fact, the only way to do this is with a single network, right? To get the economies of scale. All right, so that's where we are. So I'll tell you, there are a lot of implications of this. Again, we don't think about it. One of them is it was very difficult to get new research done. I lived through a period of maybe 10, 15 years of not being able to write proposals if I could not, this was deployable on the internet. You could not write a proposal to change the internet. Whatever you did had to work on the current internet, and if not, doesn't matter how good the idea is, forget it. We're not going to fund it because it doesn't work on this current network that we have. And no one could think of doing anything different. The idea of scale was also very important. If you can get something to work with 100 people, forget it. It needs to work for 100 million. Okay. The other thing that it affected was it was very difficult to validate. So let's say you come up with an idea and to fix things. But how are you going to test it, right? The network is working and doing things, but how are you going to test it? They wouldn't let you test it on the operational network, on campus or an ISP's network. So there was all this stuff about these test beds, right? I mean, I think people got tired of this, and I don't, there's a little bit of that going on, but certainly not large-scale test bed. M-Bone, Q-Bone, people that have been around will remember some of these things. But these are things to try out different 6-bone, for example, for IP version 6. Planet Lab, the latest thing was Genie, which also fell flat. A lot of money spent on this in the US, and it didn't really achieve the objective of trying to test something at scale. Okay, so there's another implication that, and I love to tell this story because I think there are lessons there. Okay, so as this one network was getting developed, people realized, look, yeah, one network, but we need to agree on what this network is going to look like, particularly with the standards architecture, the protocol architecture. Okay, and it had to be simple. You couldn't do something very complicated because it had to be very large scale. But it's really difficult to agree, and there is. At that point, there were really two things that were kind of in contention. There was this OSI, which I showed you the picture from Tenenbaum's book from the cover page, the 7 layers of the OSI reference model, and there was, and this was international kind of effort done in international telecom, essentially, standards organizations, which seemed like the right way to kind of push international standards. And then there was this ARPA network architecture that was a little bit simpler, that was only 4 layers, but it was really viewed as experiment at the time. Okay, so let's look at what it looked like in the moment. So this is from Schwartz. I love this book. I should say that Misha Schwartz is like one of the pioneers in networking, and I think there's no criticism certainly of his contribution. But it gives you the mindset, because we were all thinking like that. It wasn't just everyone was thinking. So here's what it's. TCP is an older standard than ISO TP class 4. TP class 4 is one of the protocols in the OSI layer. Okay. Very different from TCP, a lot of it. And he talks about TP4, but he says TCP is an older standard. It is expected that TCP and ISO TP4 will coexist for some time. That happened. But the use of TCP will begin to decrease. It is of interest nonetheless to describe briefly some of the features of TCP. So TCP, okay, it's nice, we're going to talk about it a little bit, but it's going to go away, don't worry. And I was teaching my students this, by the way. I mean, this was in '87, I used this textbook, and I spent a lot on TP4, the wave of the future guide, everyone. I don't know what we are doing to our students now in this way. I don't know what it is that I'm teaching my students that will completely fall flat and totally useless. Right? But I know I'm doing something. So just be aware that this is going on. Right? This is going on today, we don't know until 30 years later to know what it is. Right? Okay, so what happened is the OSI was an official standard that had support by governments. It was how standards were done in telecom. You voted on things. You fully specify things because before you throw it out the industry to implement. TCP/IP was, their standard document called requests for comment. Come on. You can't be serious to tell me go and implement this. You're just asking what I think of it. That's what the request for comment is. Now, no one spells it out, it's just RFC. But basically, it's very hard to take it seriously, whereas these things have the stamps of all these different governments. Okay. And the approval was totally by consensus. They sit in the room, says, everyone okay? That's it. And then, but they had this one thing, which is they insisted to implement it and test interoperability before they write it down. And in fact, the specification is really in the implementation, not in any document. Okay, so, in 1989, the governments got involved in this and said, well, this TCP/IP is nice, but it's subject to abuse. People can go to these meetings and push their own ideas. What we're going to do is forget about it every time, and US government said that, but other governments said that every time you buy something, it has to be OSI compatible. You can't buy TCP/IP products. Okay? This story is lost, by the way, because I don't know people, but everyone was paying attention, and then other government, there was something called UK gossip. These were big documents that said if you want to procure networking or telecom equipment, it had to obey this set of protocols. Basically OSI, no TCP/IP. I actually looked for the actual document. It disappeared. I had it, but I found this article. So it tells basically what was going on. Effective August 1990, the OSI protocol specified in GOSSIP become the sole mandatory interoperable protocol suite and must be included in all proposals for new automated information systems and major upgrades which require network services. So this is the US government saying, I will not buy anything. That's a lot of money. Now, fast forward. Ultimately, this fizzled. But here's so you're thinking, okay, the IATF must have stood up to this. You can't do this because our technology is really good, and we're going to push for it and sell it. No, this is what they said. RFC 1169/1990. The internet community represented by the IAB and the Internet Engineering Task Force are fully committed to integrating OSI into Internet. Never happened. As it is recognized that OSI is an international standard networking protocol. We are taking sound technical steps to integrate OSI in a fashion and on a schedule that assures current levels of service to users of the existing. So, you're reading, so if you're a student or a researcher, you're reading RFCs, the IATF is saying this, let's go study OSI because that's going to be again the future. Again, I don't know what it is that we're looking at, reading today, whatever that looks like this. I have no idea, but we couldn't tell them. But of course, this didn't happen. So finally, there's agreement, but it's not what you would expect. And actually, this is another article. It's interesting because this comes from Texas. So at some point, these governments realized we can't find stuff to buy that's meeting OSI, so we're just going to buy TCP/IP, and the heck with this menu. And so it just drops. The Texas government drops buy OSI. What I find fascinating is I pulled this to show you that the OSI protocols were gone. But what I found is this one that actually talks about APPN tops TCP. So at the same time that TCP/IP was being bought and OSI is being dropped, people were arguing there's something better. APPN tops TCP/IP in performance space-up. But again, that's not the point, right? The point, we're not looking for something better, just give us something to buy and we need to run our networks. APPN, by the way, is IBM's answer to TCP/IP, advanced peer-to-peer networks, not what you think. Anyway, it's a long story, but it's an IBM product that revised their SNAs. Okay, so why no OSI today? Okay, so I mean, if you look at the literature, you'll see that there are several reasons. One of them is that TCP/IP was being distributed freely with BSD Unix, and that made it, a lot of people use it because they didn't have to pay anything for it. The mechanism of rough consensus and running code was more concrete. You had something that worked, and not just voting. And then, you get people that make this argument that the reason it succeeded was because it's perfect, right? There's, you couldn't think it was the optimum. Or it could be, so I'll just leave you with this. It could be what, so this, if you want a book to read over the holidays, but it could be one of these trending things, right? It could have gone in a lot of different ways. And basically, Black Swan is basically nothing can predict it, which is true about TCP/IP. It has extreme impact, which it does. And there are lots of explanations for why it succeeded, but they happen afterwards, right? They don't happen before. And in fact, that's probably true in this case. Okay, so now let's keep looking and look at this fragmentation business. So again, I made this argument that I really want, someone to work in my house with this set of tools, not that one size fits all. So we said ossification has broken the cycle, but again, I've also argued that these services now are really very compelling. And increasingly, there's a lot of money to be made in the services. So if the network is not responding and you have a lot of money, then you're just going to go on the side and do your own thing, right? And that is really what's happening. So the network demands continue to increase as increased scale. Content providers are there, and I'm thinking, Google, all the social networks, Amazon, all these people, they're big, Netflix. There's a lot of money, and there is no stopping them. You can't say, sorry, you can't do this because the network can't do it. Right? They're just going to go off and do their work. And so what happened, that if you think about those are basically the unstoppable force, the demand with people with a lot of money behind them. And the internet is ossified, it's just immovable. What happened is the network is fragmented. So the question is, are we back to this 1985 world with many networks floating around? And in fact, I would argue we're probably past this point. It's just we don't talk about it that way. So there are three manifestations of this. I'll go over quickly. First one is the flattening of the internet. The internet today, even though in principle it looks very complicated, all the autonomous systems and the networks connected to everything with hierarchies. The reality is this, that you are here, you have an access ISP, it could be your home ISP or it could be your campus ISP, and then you have the content provider. The rest of the network is totally invisible. So all you see is basically you going up here. It's even worse than this today because many content providers actually can embed stuff in the first network. Like Netflix has these Netflix appliance that caches videos. There are actually ways for the content provider to interface and adjust and slice the network, the access network in ways. And so this, I'm going to call it zero-hop network. Essentially, you don't really leave your access network in some sense. And if you leave it just, in the same kind of structure. So this is one manifestation, but a kind of a more extreme case of this, and this is a question I want to ask. If you're using Google, any Google service, Gmail, YouTube, are you using the internet? I mean, it's a legitimate question to ask, because what's going on is this. What I have here is a trace route, and this is from me at Georgia Tech to some Google service. This is me at Georgia Tech, and this is the Google service here, which trace route basically shows you the steps you go. What happens is the first few steps is the Georgia Tech network, then we cross somewhere here into the Google network, and we're done. Right? What happened to these 70,000 nodes and all that? They're gone. Right? So there is really none of them. In fact, once you cross into the Google network, I have no idea what's going on. Right? It may be TCP/IP, it may not be. We don't really know what's going on. In addition, there are things that traceroute doesn't see, like middle boxes and stuff that that actually intercept things along the way. So it's a very different kind of structure. Worse still, end-to-end. Google now has this quick protocol that is pushing, and it's getting a standardization that's replacement for TCP/IP, and in fact for HTTP and TLS, a security, transport security. And so if you use, and you can see this, but if you do some incantation on a Google Chrome browser and you're accessing the Google services, you'll see you don't actually use TCP, you're using some quick version of it. So basically, so the network itself is Georgia Tech Google. The end-to-end is a Google protocol. Okay? Worse. This actually was happening in Atlanta, and it's still, there is a Google access network in Atlanta. So you could buy Google Fiber. I don't know if it ever made it to Canada or not. But the whole service is gone now. But they built it up in certain places, but stopped expanding. So now my access network, which was the only non-Google thing, is now Google's. So the question is, now I'm using my Google Fiber over the Google network, the Google end-to-end protocol. Is this now the internet? Is this the network that we're all connected to? Okay, so I'll leave, this is a rhetorical question that I'll leave it up to you to think. Now there's things that are more obvious that I'm going to call bypass networks that, and I apologize for going over, we started a little bit late, so we're But there are a lot of bypass networks. So these are networks that are not the internet, both from end to end, all the way, and it's obvious. It's not like Google you have to think about it. Here you don't have to think about it. Spread networks is one of the oldest, it's a stock trading kind of link from New York to Chicago to give you very low latency for trades. So this has been around for a while. Because the internet just can't give you these kinds of latencies. And you can lose billions of dollars if your latency goes beyond a few milliseconds. Sigfox is an interesting one. This is a network, this is an IoT network that allows you to connect your IoT device to servers over something that's totally not the internet. Right? There is no internet inside. It's built up with over cell towers, but it's not cellular either. And they call it zero-G network. Okay? It's very, in some sense, low-tech, but it's designed to work at low power for low-power devices. In fact, as I was updating my slide, I found that Sigfox actually has coverage in Kitchener. So that's and various places in southern Ontario and Quebec. So anyway, so this is real and it's here, right? And it's not the internet. Haste is actually another. It's called now Exit Ladder. It's really for gamers because again, internet latency is too high for people serious about gaming, and you can. And again, this bypasses the internet with its own. They have their own routers. They have everything. FirstNet is a first responder network, again from lessons drawn from history of first responders needing to contend for network resources with other people playing games and stuff. So I think it's obvious why you need a separate network with its own set of resources. So anyway, so there's a lot of these examples, and they keep coming of these bypass networks, and a lot of traffic on them, a lot of applications, a lot of users, and so on. So ultimately, this is what we have, right? We have the traditional internet, right? This is the user, this is the internet. Then we have these flat version of the internet. And then, so this is still, close, and then I think we'll talk about community ISPs, but those are also kind of isolated networks. We have these zero-hop networks where the content provider is embedded in your access network. You never really touch the big internet. And then we have these bypass networks. Some of them are totally bypassed. Some of them use a little bit of the access. So anyway, so this is really what it looks like to me. It's not a single network. There's a lot of different networks with different technologies. Okay, so what? So basically, I think, I think people don't talk about it as much. I think maybe people are worried that it admits the failure of the technology, but it doesn't. I mean, I think this is just us, getting mature and go forward.
My class.
Did I lose I lost the Zoom connection. I'm going to close this. I think 12 o'clock ended it or something. Yeah.
No, it's still on.
It's still on? All right, so so basically, I think people were trying to fight ossification. There's a lot of clean slate work, basically building networks from clean slate. But ultimately, I think, don't worry about it, right? I mean, I don't think we're failing today by ossification. The network works and it does what it does, but we're also doing a lot of things that are on the side and enabling that more service to users. There actually is a downside. So this one network had some upside. One of them is the economy of scale, which we're beginning to lose. The other interesting thing is that if you're now Netflix, if you conceive of something and you're Netflix, you can't, right? Netflix, when it started, rode on the one internet. Today, actually, Netflix has a lot of its own infrastructure. So it's very difficult now to get started as a startup new service that doesn't have a lot of money. So that's the downside of where we are. Okay, so I remind you of the takeaways. There's this iterative process. Single network is not necessarily obvious thing, and then we are probably seeing this increasing use of many networks. I should say that it's a longer story, but we've had people argue that many nets actually is a way to isolate national networks from, and I don't want to advocate that in fact. Some of these people use my term, many nets, to do that, and I just don't want to be associated with this, but it's not what I'm not advocating anything bad. I'm just saying this is what's happening, and in fact, it's a good thing. Okay. So let's go now. So I promise you that we will go to 2050. It's actually interesting to go rewatch the movie because he goes from 1985 to 2015, and 2015 looks nothing like what I remember. But anyway, okay, but no, wait. So what I want to do though is that I want to test my hypothesis. So I want to predict things before we go, right? So that you don't say he's cheated and now he looks and now he. So I'm going to predict a few things, okay? Again, you remember prediction is difficult, especially about the future. So first thing is it's obvious that we're going to have some energy issues later, in a few years. We have it already. And so I'm going to say that perhaps always on networks is not maybe the way to go. So maybe ultimately we're going to have to figure a way to run around networks without expending a lot of energy. In fact, there is a lot of talk today about video streaming eating up a lot of energy. The problem is there's actually two sides of this that people are arguing. I mean, this is a lot if you think about it. Streaming a 2-hour movie is the equivalent of boiling 10 kettles of water. That's a lot. I mean, if you think about how many 2-hour movies people watch. But then there are some people saying, no, that's not true. And actually, I haven't found good reliable source for this. But I suspect it does eat up a lot of power because remember, it's not just your device, it's what the server is doing. There are places, and this is everywhere now, but this was from a wildfire in the Bay Area, where basically they just had to shut down, and people lost power. Okay, so, networks stop working, but maybe we should account for this in the future, where networks have to continue to work in some fashion. I'll point you to some research. This is one of my colleagues in Georgia Tech, Josiah Hester, who works on this batteryless computing. It's a fascinating thing. So you can look it up. This is an article from his cool work that shows up at the Wall Street Journal. But he has a Game Boy that you can play a game on it, but it doesn't require any batteries. And it's actually your own clicks that generate enough power to power the game. There's solar panels on it, but that's not enough. And then the most important thing is there are ways for it to recover if it ever runs out of battery. So it checkpoints and covers everything. So then he puts it out in the sun or underneath just a light, and then you can restart the game from where it stopped. So this is fascinating stuff. There is potential now that we can think of batteryless and powerless kind of computing, and so why not batteryless and powerless network? The other thing I want to pull up a little bit and look at society's reaction to networking. And there's clearly a lot of things. But I want to point you to one thing here. There's this movement that's called the slow medium that is basically complaining about the network being too fast. I mean, who complains about networks being too fast? So basically they're saying, we're moving not bits, but information very, very fast. And that is hurting us as a society and as human beings. And so we should slow down. We should be more deliberate and much more careful. And in fact, today there's a lot of junk. And if it's expensive to publish junk, you won't get it. So this is really the reaction to that. I love this title from New York Times article, Internet of Way Too Many Things. And Internet of Things is great, but there are things that really shouldn't be connected to the Internet. But maybe we're just going crazy. So that's one thing that could happen. We could start getting movements, like the green movement and so on, that actually have implications on how we run our networks and what's a good network in some sense. It's not always faster and more bandwidth and all that. So again, something to think about. There's the opposite of this. There are now people thinking about extreme connectivity, and this actually scares the heck out of me. So this is, again, from work from a former colleague, Gregory about that's Standard said at Georgia Tech, about this Internet of Materials. Like I said, that scares me. Gregory about this. If you read what their goal is to enable ordinary objects such as walls, carpet, furniture, jewelry, and cups to do computational things without looking like today's computational things. Now, computational things includes networking, right? They have to be connected to these things. So that scares me. I mean, everything here is computing something. Anyway, but that is an extreme movement, and if that happens, the networking that we know today just doesn't work. Right? It doesn't matter how scalable you do things. We are not at this scale. We're not at this scale that every panel in that wall is actually computing and communicating. So that could happen, and now we have to think about what are we talking about in terms of networking with these kinds of objects. Okay. The last thing I want to talk about is, there was a time when people moved freely around the world, cross borders, no one thinks about it. Customs actually was a bigger deal than in person. They didn't want you to carry stuff without paying duty. Of course, today, we have national boundaries. We don't think about it, but regulate the movement of people very strictly across national boundaries. Now, this could happen for data, and in fact, it's already happening today, and it could happen at a much larger scale. So already in Europe, of course, you have this safe harbor kind of judgment that basically that data cannot move around and be stored outside of Europe and move from Europe to the US. In fact, there's something at Georgia Tech, when we ditched our own mail system and we had to buy a new mail service, we went to Google, and our rule was you cannot store our mail outside the US. And they said, we can't promise you that. So we went to Microsoft, I think, or people with Outlook and so on. So basically, I think it's not just everywhere now. We have rules about where the data can be and where it can move. And I can see that increasingly being the case. Kleinrock, one of the fathers of the internet, talks about the organization of the internet more because of national networks. This is an old article about Russia building its, from 2018, about building its own internet. How there are really 3 internets today, not really one because of the strict isolation between national networks. Okay, so now we're ready. Now I've given you my prediction, so now we're going to move. We're going to go to 2050. But then what happened was, first thing is they took me around, and everything I said actually happened, right? So you can believe me on that. But then they said, well, there was one thing you didn't predict. Let me show you. So they showed me this. There's a long line waiting in this thing that's basically the Department of Internet license. And I'm saying, what is that? They said, well, because now to use the internet, you need a license. How you drive a car, you need a driver's license. So now to use the internet, you need. And I said, look, they said you have to. If you look back at the history of driver's licenses, it's actually very interesting because we didn't have them for a while, and then there was a mechanism to collect money. It wasn't really about testing. You had to pay £5 or whatever to get a license, but no one tested you. It's a revenue kind of making thing. And there was a lot of resistance. In fact, I think what I remember is in the 50s, one of the Dakotas in the U.S. didn't have driver's licenses until the 50s. So you could just get in the car and no one. Increasingly, though, in 2035, people started worrying about people getting on the internet and causing harm. And it's true that highly unregulated, highly scalable digital connectivity today you can do something and 20 million people can see it. Now, in 2035, it went to like 200 million people with tweets, whatever it is at that point, would reach these large numbers. So you couldn't just let loose anyone on this network because you can cause all sorts of harm, right? And so what they did was they basically limited your scope and also limited your speed, right? So basically, they had all these different license categories, right? That Class A, you could communicate, you could go on the internet, you can only talk to close families, your parents, your siblings, maybe aunts and uncles, right? Okay, what kind of harm can you do, say you shouldn't have said that, and teach you a lesson. Class B, now, there's more testing here. There was kind of gated communities, maybe, the School of Computer Science at Waterloo was one of these. We all know each other, he writes like this all the time, so we're not doing that. So it was okay. And now Class C is the big one that basically you can put your data on these non-curated spaces. There's no control. You were trained in this digital custody certification. Basically, you could, you didn't really put fake content anymore because there was some, custody that this was a real image that was right, and you were trained in doing all that. Reality was we do it the same. We do the because there's training that I have to do, but they told me only if I stay in spring. But we have training. For Georgia Tech, it's like 3 hours of training of videos and things I have to watch. They also send you an email, a phishing email afterwards. You don't know where it's coming from. And they test whether you're going to click or not. And if you click, you fail, and you have to go in. So anyway, so we do this today, but this is going to happen now in more serious because, because you get this certificate, you're not blocked, right? So people know that you're safe and will let you drive on the. Now you get even now these this is like the equivalent of driving a car. Now you can drive trucks and these semis, and ultimately I'll show you the fighter airplane version. But fast media certification, basically, you're now trusted to put something, everyone can hear it, you're some kind of big shot, but you have certification. And then ultimately you have this access to, this is like driving or flying a fighter plane, the space-time browser. there are two books that come out of this talk. The first one is The Black Swan. This is the other one if you're a fan of science fiction. It's actually interesting. But they have this notion of space-time communication, that you could click and find anything at any point in time and any part of the world, and you can figure out what happened. Anyway, but this is Class E, very difficult to get to, a lot of testing, only a few people. So anyway, so we found that. So one question to you: if you had a chance to go to 2050, you're a networking researcher. Well, and you only had one thing you could do. What is the one thing you could do? To see if anyone can figure it out. If you watch the movie or one of these movies, you would know what I'm talking about, but you have to translate. It's something you can take and bring back with you, yeah.
Probably like all the results of all the sports matches.
World Cup, so it's close. I mean, the sports thing is what they got, but you're not the network. You're obviously not a networking researcher.
Whether TCP and you're going to be around still?
Well, yeah.
Don't change the future.
Don't what?
Change the future.
No.
Around?
So you're all very nice and very ethical, and this is what I would get. I get Proceedings of ACM's 2050. I mean, talk about being ahead of your time in your publications of research. So I went and got that. It turns out that it's too hot to have the conference anywhere else. So, but anyway, that's what I left with, and now you know why my research is what it is. Okay, thank you.
We are already over time, but I think if you don't mind, we can take maybe a couple of questions. Any questions? Yes, Ammar?
So I'm fascinated by the notion that maybe we are back to these multiple networks. I'm not sure what's your stand on it, whether is this an opportunity for improving innovation and creating space for innovation, that we can revisit this networking architecture and invent again, or are we just with many partition network going back to creating a bigger mess? That interconnectivity, end-to-end connectivity, quality of service, or is going to be harder now again?
I mean, I think it can go either way, right? So I think certainly there is room for innovation. I think the one thing I didn't mention at all is the SDN kind of, or the programmability of networks, which is a big deal today, and that's one way innovation is enabled. In fact, your separate network doesn't actually have to be different hardware. It can be just programmed differently. In fact, you can program on the same network, just virtualize and slice things, right? With all the programmability. So there is, I think a lot of it is already there, right? A lot of this is here, and people accept that as innovation. I think there is potential for things to get really difficult. And I think that paper I showed you with the Nestim, they're trying to extend programmability into the access network and combine that with, I mean, I think you can get some serious complexity because these different networks now are doing different things. I think already there is so much complexity in the access, the cellular access network, that the interfaces are relatively dull between it and the internet. You just have IP and going through. But it could potentially be something that you will see more. So I really don't know. I think both are happening today. I mean, the point is that there is no more acceptance of innovation in ways that we didn't think about before. And then there is complexity, I think, especially in the real world.
Another question? Maybe I can ask you a question. I think in one of your slides, when you talked about the moving from many networks to the internet, and you said it wasn't an obvious choice. I wonder whether it was a choice at all, or just a fact.
So,
Because the internet was built mostly for data, for transporting data, but then we evolved it to include other things.
yeah, I mean, it's not that, I mean, if you think about, okay, if it's a choice, who is the one that made the decision? No one, right? It kind of grew organically. And it's, but it could have grown in different ways, what I'm trying to say. I think, you know, my first awareness that the internet is going to play, the internet that I was playing with at school, right? We had email and we had, you know, CSNet and all that, which was the first hint that I got that this was going to kind of graduate into something different was when we started getting America Online, and there was when we get the CDs to connect to the internet. But even then, if you remember, you didn't connect to the internet. You went, you just got the software, and then you connected to their servers. So basically, it was just communication, and their servers had everything. So it was a separate network completely. So slowly things kind of, I think that grew organically, and the reasons I gave are really, it's the only way to think about this for economy of scale. There wasn't really a whole lot of money to be made at that time, if you think about it. No one was, there were no Google, no YouTube, no all of this, Amazon, so no one was making money. And so everyone was riding on this thing, and it was relatively cheap. Today, I think people have choices. I think that's the difference today. Google has a choice. It can work on this network, or it can build its own thing. So and it has the money, so it builds its own.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.